The final months of the Second World War had left Europe scarred, weary, and drenched in uncertainty. In a remote PO camp tucked into the rolling hills of the American Midwest, dawn broke slowly, casting soft golden light over wooden barracks and frost-tipped grass. The chill of early morning whispered through the camp, mingling with the faint scent of smoke from distant kitchens. For the women who had endured months of rationed meals, frigid barracks, and relentless anxiety, this day would awaken senses they thought long dulled by war. Inside the mess hall, shadows stretched across the worn wooden floors, and the faint clatter of trays and utensils echoed like a prelude to a symphony they had never heard before. German female POWs, women who had navigated the chaos of occupied territories, imprisonment, and uncertainty, now found themselves in a foreign land, standing at the threshold of something entirely unexpected. Their eyes, tired yet alert, scanned the horizon of tables overflowing with food, rich, warm, and abundant beyond their imagination. The aroma of sizzling bacon, freshly baked bread, golden scrambled eggs, and steaming potatoes filled the air, cutting through the cold with an invisible, irresistible warmth. No one had warned them that breakfast here would be a spectacle, a feast so lavish it bordered on disbelief. Each tray laid out before them seemed almost unreal, a contrast to the meager rations they had known for months. Their expressions shifted from cautious curiosity to wide-eyed amazement as they realized the scale, the generosity, and the undeniable comfort represented in every plate. It was more than a meal. It was a revelation, a fleeting taste of normalcy, a reminder that even amid war, the human spirit could still indulge in the simple pleasure of abundance. The moment the German women stepped into the mess hall, time seemed to stretch, as if the universe itself had paused to let them take in the sight before them. They had been told to line up, to receive their breakfast, but no words could have prepared them for this. The hall was enormous, stretching further than any barracks they had ever seen, its wooden floors gleaming faintly in the early morning light that spilled through tall, frost-covered windows. Shadows of the women's uniforms flickered across the polished boards as they moved forward hesitantly, their boots tapping lightly, echoing in the vast emptiness. Their eyes widened, scanning the room, drinking in the scene as though it were a painting they could not yet comprehend. Long tables, polished and sturdy, stretched across the hall like runways, groaning under the weight of food. Plates were stacked high with golden scrambled eggs, still steaming from the pans, their surface glistening with a buttery sheen that caught the light. Bacon sizzled and curled in cast iron skillets, the smell sharp and savory, making their mouths water involuntarily. There were sausages, plump and brown, resting in neat rows, glistening with juices that ran down onto warm, soft bread laid alongside them. Bowls of thick oatmeal, topped with brown sugar and cream, steamed gently, sending curls of fragrant heat into the chill of the morning air. And then there were the fruits. Apples polished to a gleaming red, bananas soft and fragrant, oranges cut into perfect wedges that glistened as if kissed by sunlight. The women froze as they approached the tables, their hands tightening around their coats. The sheer volume of food was staggering, almost absurd. In their memories, meals had been little more than a few stale slices of bread, a thin broth that barely warmed them, or scraps salvaged from days gone by. Here in this mess hall, every fear of hunger, every pang of deprivation, seemed to vanish. It was not merely a meal. It was a festival, a celebration, a banquet laid out in defiance of the lean months they had endured. They took a step closer, then another, each movement hesitant, almost reverent, as though they were intruding upon a sacred space. Some of the women exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and awe. Eyes darted from skillet to skillet, from plate to plate, from the neatly arranged stacks of bread to the steaming pots of potatoes, each item seeming to mock the privation of the past months. A few gasped softly, covering their mouths with trembling hands, while others let their gaze linger, silently absorbing the overwhelming generosity. Their thoughts were a jumble of astonishment and incredulity. How could there be so much? How could food exist in such abundance? Was this a dream? Or had they finally crossed into a world untouched by the harsh realities of war? A wave of warmth from the ovens reached them as they neared, mingling with the cool morning air in a delicate, almost surreal balance. The aroma of sizzling bacon, of baked bread, of eggs melting in butter, enveloped them entirely. It was intoxicating, an invisible force tugging at every sense, demanding recognition, forcing the body to respond. A few of the women reached instinctively for a plate, almost afraid to touch it, as though the physical act of claiming a piece of this bounty would somehow shatter the spell. But the plates were generous, heavy, and inviting, stacked high with more than enough for anyone who dared take one. Some could not help the instinctive comparison that raced through their minds. They thought of the thin soup that had been their dinner the night before, of the crust of bread barely enough to line a stomach, of the cold, flavorless porridge that had been served in the camp over the past weeks. And now, in this single moment, here was a room that contradicted every hardship, every pang of hunger, every quiet desperation they had endured. The contrast was almost painful, yet mesmerizing, too vast to comprehend, too vivid to ignore. The women moved along the tables slowly, taking in every detail. A skillet of sausages hissed as it released a burst of steam, curling in the air like smoke from a tiny fire. Bread loaves stacked in columns exuded warmth, their crusts golden brown, soft yet crisp, inviting hands to break pieces and taste the richness. Butter glistened, melting slowly over hot toast, and bowls of fresh fruit seemed to shimmer with color, as though the morning light itself had been captured within them. Every tray, every dish, every pot was meticulously arranged, orderly yet overflowing, as if the cooks had worked tirelessly to create not just sustenance, but a spectacle of generosity. Some of the women whispered to one another, voices barely audible, trembling with a mixture of disbelief and excitement. "So much, it's impossible," one murmured, her eyes fixed on the towering stacks of eggs and bread. Another reached for a steaming slice of toast, holding it close as though the act itself would make the moment tangible. Yet their expressions betrayed more than hunger. They were absorbing an entirely different kind of sensation, a recognition of abundance, care, and attention that transcended the simple act of eating. Each woman, in her own way, realized that this breakfast was a gift, not merely of food, but of humanity extended in a simple, universal language, nourishment. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, their cautious hesitation began to melt. Plates were lifted, trays were carried, and the first tentative bites were taken. Some chewed in silence, savoring the richness, the warmth, the flavors so foreign yet immediately comforting. Others glanced around, noticing the reactions of their fellow prisoners. The shared wonder, the small smiles, the quiet laughter that began to bubble under the surface. It was a collective awakening, an unspoken acknowledgement that even amid war, even amid captivity, moments of beauty, comfort, and abundance could still exist. Time seemed to bend around them as they continued along the line of tables. Every step revealed another layer of generosity: more bread, more eggs, more steaming pans of bacon and sausage, more fruit, more spreads, more butter. The hall was alive with the quiet, anticipatory energy of those encountering something unimaginable. Every detail, the glint of sunlight off a knife, the way the steam rose in lazy curls from a pot, the rhythmic clatter of utensils against plates, added to the sensory symphony that engulfed them. By the time they reached the end of the hall, every woman carried a plate, every face carried astonishment, every mind struggled to comprehend what they had just witnessed. And yet, amid the astonishment, a quiet understanding settled in. This was more than food. This was a story told without words, a narrative of generosity and human care that transcended uniforms, nationality, and the conflicts that had brought them here. Each bite taken, each morsel consumed, was a silent acknowledgement of resilience, a small reclaiming of joy, a momentary reclamation of humanity in a world that had been defined by cruelty and deprivation for far too long. They understood that this moment, this breakfast, would linger, not just on their palates, but in their memories long after the war ended and the mess hall grew silent once more. For months, the women had lived in a world shaped by hunger, not the mild, passing kind that could be soothed with a small meal, but the deep, persistent ache that gnawed at the bones, hollowed the face, and lingered in every quiet moment of the day. Hunger had become a shadow that followed them from one camp to another, an uninvited companion that never truly left. Their meals in the months before capture had been meager, increasingly scarce as the war devoured resources with merciless efficiency. They remembered digging through ration tins to find crumbs clinging stubbornly to the corners, scraping the last traces of flavor from the bottom of bowls, and watching others barter with desperation for even a half piece of bread. And now, standing in an American mess hall with plates overflowing, the contrast was so extreme it felt like stepping through a tear in reality. Every sight, every smell, every taste triggered memories of deprivation, layering the present with ghosts of the past. The feast before them wasn't just surprising, it was almost incomprehensible. Some of the women stared at their plates as though afraid the food would disappear the moment they blinked, returning them to the cold, thin rations of the camps they had known before. One woman found herself remembering winter nights, when the wind howled through broken barracks boards, rattling the few utensils they had managed to keep. Dinner had been a watery stew ladled from a pot so thin the bottom often burned, because there was so little to keep it from scorching. The vegetables floating within were barely more than shreds, softened into near nothingness. Occasionally, someone found a potato chunk, a treasure, a miracle, but such finds were rare, almost mythic. Bread had been rationed to slices so small they could be eaten in a single bite, though no one ever consumed them that quickly. Instead, each woman had developed her own rituals: nibble slowly, savor every grain of flour, let the mouth linger on flavor that barely existed. Here the bread was warm, soft, freshly baked. It tore apart in thick chunks that released steam as they separated, the scent rich and full, carrying hints of yeast, grain, and warmth. Some of the women held the bread close to their faces, inhaling deeply before daring to taste it, as if needing confirmation that it was real. Butter melted upon contact, seeping into the pores of the bread, dripping slightly down the sides. One woman closed her eyes as the first bite touched her tongue, And for a moment, she forgot the camps, forgot the cold, forgot the sorrow. All she could feel was warmth, soft, rich, impossible warmth. The fruit was almost more shocking than the bread. Fruit had become something from another lifetime, something that grew only in memory, or in stories told long ago. Apples in Germany had been hoarded, shared only among children when possible, rationed fiercely as the war dragged on. Bananas had disappeared entirely, a luxury so distant that many prisoners could hardly remember their taste. But here, in the mess hall, the apples shone like polished glass, the bananas rested in thick bunches, and the oranges, bright, fragrant, bursting with juice, seemed to glow in the morning light as though the sun had been cut into wedges. One of the women picked up an orange wedge with trembling fingers. She pressed it gently, watching droplets of juice glisten on the surface. Bringing it to her lips, she took a slow, cautious bite. The flavor exploded instantly, sweet, tangy, fresh, alive, so vibrant that tears pooled in her eyes before she could stop them. She covered her mouth, overcome by the intensity of something so simple. Another woman beside her took a bite of an apple and gasped softly at the crunch, the juicy burst. The familiar yet forgotten sensation of biting into something fresh and whole. Had it really been that long since she had tasted real fruit? Her memories blurred. Months felt like years, and years felt like fragments of a past life. But the fruit in her hand was undeniably real. Then came the sausages. Thick, browned, glistening, uneven in the way that only freshly grilled food could be. They gave off a smell so rich and savory that the women felt their chests tighten. Some remembered standing in long lines outside ration depots back home, hoping there would be enough meat for everyone, knowing there rarely was. Others thought of the thin slices of sausage that had been served in the camps they had passed through, slices so small they barely covered a corner of a plate, served cold, flavorless from lack of fat. But here the sausages were full, plump, oozing juices that stained the plates and mixed with melted butter. When the women finally tasted them, the richness was overwhelming. They ate slowly, reverently, as though each bite was a conversation with the universe itself. The eggs, golden and soft, drew their eyes next. Eggs had been a rarity for so long that some women had nearly forgotten what they looked like in their natural form. They had grown accustomed to egg powder or substitutes that barely resembled the real thing. But these eggs, fresh, butter, coated, steaming, were the embodiment of fullness. A few of the prisoners touched them with their utensils first, watching the edges shake gently, proof of their softness. When they tasted them, the warmth spread instantly across their tongues, down their throats, into their chests, filling them with a sensation they had not felt in months' comfort. The oatmeal was likewise shocking. It was thick, hearty, creamy, a far cry from the watery, greyish porridge they had endured before. Brown sugar melted into its surface, swirling into caramel-coloured patterns. Fresh cream pooled around the edges. Some of the women stared at it, bewildered. They had forgotten that porridge could have flavour, that it could warm rather than simply exist as sustenance. One woman dipped her spoon slowly, hesitating, then tasting. The sweetness sent a tremor through her. She wasn't sure whether to smile or cry. And then there was the coffee. Real coffee. Not the bitter substitutes they had grown accustomed to, but genuine, freshly brewed, bold and fragrant. The aroma alone felt like a luxury. One of the women cupped her hands around the warm mug, letting the heat seep into her stiff fingers. She inhaled deeply before taking a sip, feeling the warmth spread across her chest in waves. Coffee had once been a simple morning routine, something taken for granted. Now it felt like liquid gold. All these sensations triggered memories, some painful, some bittersweet, some numbing. But the breakfast before them was so overwhelmingly abundant that it softened the edges of those memories, not erasing them, but placing something warm and gentle beside them. The women looked around, watching others eat, watching expressions shift from disbelief to gratitude, from shock to quiet happiness. There was no competition here, no scarcity, no tension over who would get the last piece of bread or the largest portion. The tables were refilled continuously as the cooks moved with practiced ease, ensuring nothing ran out. This alone was astonishing. Food had always been a resource to be guarded, rationed, divided. But here the supply seemed endless, almost magical. Some of the women began to talk quietly among themselves. They spoke about how long it had been since they had tasted real butter. They exchanged memories of childhood breakfasts, of meals shared with family long before the war twisted their lives into something unrecognizable. They recounted the emptiness they had grown used to, the gnawing hunger that had shaped their days. And now they spoke of the disbelief they felt, the gratitude that clenched their throats, the strange mixture of joy and sorrow that accompanied each bite. The contrasts between then and now grew sharper with every moment. Their past meals had been reminders of confinement, of uncertainty, of powerlessness. This breakfast, lavish, warm, endless, became a reminder that the world was larger than the conflict that had swallowed it whole. It showed them that even amid war, there were pockets of humanity untouched by bitterness. The food didn't erase their hardships, but it softened them. It didn't heal their wounds, but it warmed them. It didn't change the past, but it made the present bearable. As they ate, many realized that this breakfast would become one of the defining memories of their captivity. Not because of the taste alone, but because of the contrast, the impossibility of it. The magnitude of the difference between the rations they had known and the feast now before them. They had arrived expecting more scarcity, more cold, more hunger. Instead, they found tables overflowing beyond imagination, tables that symbolized a world they had nearly forgotten existed. And so they savored it all, the warmth, the flavor, the abundance, the momentary escape from the emptiness that had accompanied them for so long. In that mess hall, under sunlight and steam, surrounded by foods they thought they would never taste again, they rediscovered something simple yet profound, what it felt like to be full. Some could not help the tears that welled in their eyes, quiet, unexpected, and impossible to hold back. It wasn't just hunger being satisfied. It wasn't simply the taste of warm food or the shock of abundance. It was something deeper, something far more human. For months, they had been reduced to numbers, uniforms, categories in a system far larger than themselves. They had been treated as prisoners, strangers, reminders of a war that had torn the world apart. Yet here, over plates piled with eggs, bread, fruit, and steaming coffee, they felt something they had not felt in far too long: recognition. Not of their nationality, not of their mistakes or the circumstances of their capture, but of their humanity. The mess hall filled with soft sounds, clinking forks, quiet chewing, faint laughter that emerged in hesitant bursts, like a language forgotten and then remembered. The atmosphere shifted gently, almost imperceptibly, from tension to warmth, from caution to comfort. Some of the women wiped at their eyes discreetly, embarrassed by their own emotions. But the tears weren't born of sadness. They came from the shock of being treated not as enemies, but as people who deserved a warm meal and a moment of peace. Emotions they had buried to survive the war, fear, hope, sadness, longing, rose quietly to the surface. One woman sat with her back straight, trying to maintain composure, but as she lifted a forkful of eggs to her mouth, her hand trembled. She paused, lowered her gaze, and blinked hard. She didn't want anyone to see her cry. She had endured bombings, nights without sleep, marches across freezing fields, and interrogations. She had held herself together through all of it. Yet here, confronted with kindness, she felt her defenses crumble. A warm meal had become an unexpected assault on her emotional walls. Another woman, seated across from her, noticed the struggle. She herself had been fighting tears since taking the first bite of sausage, but seeing someone else break made her feel less ashamed. She reached out, not with words, but with a quiet glance that conveyed understanding. The two women shared a silent moment, a bond formed not out of camaraderie or shared ideology, but out of the simple human reaction to kindness. In a world where survival had meant hardening the heart, this breakfast was a reminder that softness still existed. Across the table, a pair of women let out a low, surprised laugh, the kind that bubbles up when the body is overwhelmed, and the only release is a burst of sound. One covered her face, shoulders shaking. Her friend nudged her gently, raising a piece of toast, as if offering a toast to the absurdity of crying over breakfast. The two shared a moment of relief, their laughter mingling with tears, not loud, not disruptive, but quietly powerful. The guards watching from the edges of the hall remained calm, almost invisible in their stillness. They did not bark orders. They didn't rush the women. They allowed the space to unfold naturally. Some leaned against the walls, arms crossed loosely, observing the scene with expressions that held neither hostility nor pity, only understanding. In their experience, this was normal. For the prisoners, it was extraordinary. The warmth in the room grew as conversations slowly took shape. At first, the women spoke in low whispers, unsure if they were allowed to talk freely. But as the minutes passed and no one reprimanded them, their voices grew bolder. They spoke of the food, the taste, the smell, the shock of it. A few shared stories of meals from childhood, carefully preserved memories that softened their hardened expressions. There were stories of mothers baking bread on Sunday mornings, of holiday feasts that now felt like another lifetime, of apples picked from orchards behind old farmhouses. Some spoke of the rations they had endured on the Eastern Front or in collapsing German cities near the war's end. Meals so small that they seemed like insults to the idea of nourishment. Others recalled stealing bits of potato peel, the desperate measures taken during long marches, the hollow ache of waking up hungry and going to sleep even hungrier. The stories were not meant to compete in suffering, but to release the weight each woman had been carrying silently. The food before them acted as a key, unlocking memories long suppressed. As the women ate, their voices softened, their expressions eased. They began to sit more comfortably, no longer perched tensely on the edges of their seats. Shoulders dropped from rigid posture into natural alignment. A few leaned closer to one another, speaking with an openness that had been impossible during the war. The mess hall, once just a functional building, became a refuge, a temporary shelter where no one needed to appear strong or stoic. Some of the American cooks moved between the tables quietly, replenishing dishes as they grew low. They offered no judgment, no interrogation. They simply watched, refilled trays, and ensured everyone had enough. One cook placed a fresh bowl of fruit in the center of a table, and one of the women stared at him for a moment with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. He offered a small nod, nothing more, but it was enough to break her reserve. She whispered a soft, "Thank you," a fragile, hesitant phrase spoken in accented English. The cook didn't reply with words. Instead, he smiled faintly before stepping back. That tiny exchange carried more weight than either could fully express. It wasn't a political statement or a gesture of alliance. It was a moment of simple recognition, one human acknowledging another. As the women continued eating, something subtle happened. The room warmed from the inside out. The food didn't just fill their stomachs, it softened their spirits. The air vibrated with a quiet, shared relief, a collective exhale after months of tension. Faces that had been sharp with exhaustion now softened. Eyes dulled by fear now shone, reflecting sunlight streaming through the windows. Even posture seemed to change, as though the warmth of the meal was straightening their spines from the inside. One woman, after finishing her coffee, pressed her hands around the warm mug and closed her eyes. She looked as if she was absorbing not the drink, but the comfort it represented. The heat of the cup seeped into her palms, and she held onto it as though it were an anchor. A reminder that she was still alive, still human, still capable of feeling warmth. Another woman picked up a slice of bread and stared at it for a long time before eating it. She had lived through nights where she could hear stomachs growling across the barracks, where women whispered silently to themselves to distract from hunger. The contrast hit her so hard that she lowered the bread and blinked rapidly, fighting back overwhelming emotion. She wasn't crying because the bread tasted good. She was crying because she could finally eat without worrying about tomorrow. This breakfast brought something into the room that none of them had expected: hope. Not the grand, sweeping hope of newspapers or speeches, but the quiet, personal hope that hums inside a person when they experience an act of kindness they did not think possible. It was the hope that life might not always be defined by scarcity. The hope that they might someday return home. The hope that the world might eventually untangle itself from war. And as the hall filled with warmth, with emotion, with the soft sighs of women rediscovering the simple pleasure of a meal, an unspoken bond formed. Captors and captives, separated by uniform and allegiance, momentarily stood on the same ground. The war existed outside the walls of the mess hall, but inside, humanity took priority over all else. It was in the little things, the gentle clatter of forks, the faint hum of conversation, the quiet laughter trembling through the air, that the transformation occurred. These women, who had hardened themselves to survive, now allowed themselves to soften, and the Americans, who had been taught to see the prisoners as potential threats or burdens, now saw them as women. Hungry, tired, frightened, but human. In that shared space, food became a universal language. Warmth became a bridge. And the morning meal became a moment of emotional overflow, a tear-stained reminder that even in wartime, the smallest gestures could become the most powerful. As the women lingered over the last bites of buttery toast, thick scrambled eggs, and steaming sausage, a quiet reverence settled over the hall. Unlike the hurried, tense mornings they had endured in the previous months, where breakfast was little more than a perfunctory gesture of survival. This moment was unhurried, deliberate, almost sacred. Each woman moved slowly, deliberately, as if trying to memorize every detail. The way the sunlight spilled through the frost-covered windows, illuminating steam rising from pots and pans, the gentle clatter of silverware against plates, the subtle aroma of fresh bread mingling with sizzling bacon, eggs, and butter. Every detail was seared into their memory, a tableau that would remain vivid long after the war ended. Some paused, forks suspended mid-air, eyes drifting to the hall's walls or the distant horizon through the windows. The world outside remained uncertain, torn apart by conflict. But inside this hall, everything was warm, generous, and intact. The act of eating had transformed into a meditation, a chance to reflect on the war they had endured, the hardships they had survived, and the lives they had left behind. Even those who had initially approached the meal with hesitation now lingered over the smallest morsels, savoring flavor, texture, and warmth as though they could store it inside them, bottle it, carry it back to the barracks as a talisman of comfort. The quiet reverence wasn't solely about the food. It was about what the food represented. Each dish, overflowing with abundance, was a silent testament to care, planning, and attention. No one had to ration or hoard here. Every plate, every loaf, every steaming bowl had been prepared and laid out with the explicit intention that no one would leave hungry. For women who had spent months navigating scarcity, this intentional generosity was overwhelming. Some pressed their hands together at the edge of the table, almost in disbelief, while others closed their eyes and allowed themselves to simply be present in the moment, soaking in a rare instance of safety and provision. Outside the hall, sunlight fell across frost-covered barracks, reflecting faint glimmers onto the windows. Inside, the warmth of the room seemed almost tangible. A woman lifted a slice of toast, watching steam rise slowly into the air, and allowed herself a soft smile. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried with it months of pent-up exhaustion, hunger, and emotional tension. Another woman brushed crumbs from her uniform, eyes lingering on the empty plate in front of her. For the first time in months, she felt full, not just in body, but in spirit. She felt the quiet swell of hope, the gentle affirmation that life could still hold moments of normalcy, kindness, and joy even amid the chaos of war. The meal had transformed the room into a space of shared understanding and humanity. Some women quietly shared pieces of fruit with one another, not out of necessity, but as a gesture of connection. Others gestured toward a freshly baked loaf, pointing out its texture or warmth. Small smiles appeared, sometimes exchanged across tables, a silent acknowledgement that they were all experiencing the same unexpected relief, the same moment of wonder. Laughter began to surface, soft at first, tentative, then growing in warmth as the women recognized a shared feeling that transcended uniforms, nationality, and the hardships of the past months. Conversations began to center less on the food and more on the sensation it brought, the novelty of abundance. The memory of meals from childhood, the astonishment at being cared for in a way they had not anticipated. Some spoke in hushed tones of simple pleasures they had long forgotten. The softness of fresh bread, the richness of melted butter, the warmth of coffee in cold hands. Others reflected on what they had endured, drawing contrasts between the starvation and improvisation they had known and the lavishness now before them. The room became a quiet tapestry of reflection, gratitude, and human connection stitched together by the invisible thread of shared experience. As the women paused to finish the last bites of their meal, a subtle transformation had taken place. The physical act of eating had become an emotional and spiritual experience. The room, once just a hall filled with tables and trays, had become a vessel for memory, reflection, and the delicate restoration of hope. Women who had been hardened by hunger and fear now carried themselves differently. Shoulders uncurled, eyes softer, movements more deliberate. The abundance had reminded them that survival was not just about endurance, but about the possibility of comfort, of care, and of humanity. Some stood and stretched lightly, noticing for the first time how cramped and cold the barracks had felt over the past months. Others lingered at the windows, tracing the frost patterns with their eyes as if committing every detail to memory. Every plate, every pan, every flicker of sunlight became part of a mental catalogue of the extraordinary, a moment they could carry with them, a talisman to remind them of what life could offer even in the midst of conflict. Even in silence, there was communication. One glance between women spoke volumes: gratitude, disbelief, wonder. The food had not only nourished their bodies, but also bridged invisible gaps between them. The shared experience of indulgence, of care, and of temporary relief created bonds that no hardship could undo. They had entered the mess hall as prisoners, but they left as witnesses to a simple act of humanity that transcended captivity. As the hall began to empty slowly, with women lingering over final sips of coffee or last bites of bread, a sense of quiet ceremony filled the air. The act of leaving was not hurried, it was thoughtful. Each woman seemed to carry the memory of the breakfast with her in a palpable way. Some glanced back at the tables, as if afraid the warmth of abundance might vanish if not acknowledged. Others exhaled slowly, eyes half closed, savoring the lingering aroma of eggs, bacon, and fresh bread. The memory of that breakfast would persist long after the morning light faded, long after they returned to the barracks, long after the war itself ended. It was not simply a meal, but a narrative etched into their minds of generosity, comfort, and the quiet possibility of normal life amidst chaos. Some of the women imagined retelling the experience to others, how they had seen tables groaning with food, how they had laughed, cried, and shared stories, how the simple act of eating became a lifeline for the soul. Even the smallest details, crumbs on a plate, steam curling from a coffee mug, sunlight glinting off silverware, were seared into memory, destined to be recounted with reverence. In this hall, surrounded by warmth and abundance, the women rediscovered a profound truth that even in captivity, even amid the uncertainty of war, moments of humanity could pierce the darkness. The breakfast had become a beacon, a small but undeniable affirmation that life could still be beautiful, that care could exist even in unlikely places, and that simple gestures, like a generous meal, could restore dignity, hope, and a sense of self. And so they lingered, each savoring the last taste, imprinting the memory, allowing the warmth to fill spaces long hollowed by hunger and despair. The feast had ended, but its imprint on their minds and hearts had only begun. This breakfast was more than nourishment. It was a story, a lesson, a reminder of humanity's capacity to care. It was a memory that would travel with them, long after the tables were cleared, long after the pots were washed, long after the echoes of that morning faded into history.